Here we are.
Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. I am Rob Farley, Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce, and with me is Mike Cohen. How are you doing today, Michael?
I am good. I am, again, Michael Cohen. I'm a fellow at the Century Foundation, columnist at The Guardian, and unfortunately recently departed contestant in Twitter Fight Club. So I'm very kind of sad about that today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's get a. I don't know if this will actually post before, but let's get a quick plug-in for Twitter Fighter Club, or Twitter Fight Club, and especially for Caitlin, who has Kaidid on Twitter, who has just been fantastic in terms of making Twitter Fight Club happen.
Yes, Caitlin is phenomenal, and I give her lots of credit for the time she's taken to develop the Twitter Fight Club. So good for her, and
right.
Vote early and often is my advice.
No, exactly. I mean, I was able to defeat Ali Gharib handily by an incredibly slim margin in the first round, and then I fell to Laura in the second round. Texas and Africa. She's just a juggernaut. She's just taking people apart. So
it's true. And I lost to Blake Council, who is he is a juggernaut in the Twitter Fight Club. So anyway, we could talk Twitter Fight Club all day, but there's so much stuff going on in the world to talk about, right?
Right. So there's so much stuff going on in the world that let's talk about something that happened, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago.
Okay,
so
let's do that.
You had this article column that came out last week that talked about sort of what are the lessons of Iraq? It was one of many articles that came out. What are the lessons? What lessons have we learned from the Iraq experience? That connected sort of the military lessons we learned in Iraq to the surge in Afghanistan, right? And sort of made the argument that this was an example that we had not appropriately learned from the military failure in Iraq.
Right.
I guess give that a little bit more detail, and then give that a little bit more justice, and then I'll explain why you're wrong.
Okay, that's good. Well, first of all, I mean, the key argument that I made was that we basically lost the war in Iraq. And I used the criteria of the Bush administration, which was to basically protect Americans from weapons of mass destruction and from Saddam Hussein and his alleged links to terrorism. And my basic take on the war is that it didn't make us safer at all. And we should have known that in advance. Some of us did argue that, and that even if Iraq turns into a Jeffersonian democracy. Which I sort of doubt will happen, but even if it turns into a stable country, it certainly doesn't justify going to war in the first place, and certainly isn't something that really was worth the cost, at least in the sense of the benefit it provided to U.S. national security. And the reason I argue this, the reason why I sort of harp on this point about us having lost the war, is I think it's like an addict. You have to sort of recognize, in order to sort of to fix your behavior, you kind of have to recognize you have a problem in the first place, and I think. In the case of Iraq, we haven't really, as a country, I think, fully appreciated the extent to which we lost in Iraq and the extent to which Iraq was a failure, not just of military means, but a failure, I think, of strategic thinking. And I think it was based on a number of just false assumptions about what American military power could achieve, about the nature of threats that we confront in the world, about how we define our national security interests, and that, to me, is the more important lesson about whether or not even Saddam had WMD. Even if Saddam did have WMD, it still wouldn't justify going to war. And I actually thought that he did have them. So from that point, I sort of argue that those assumptions that underpin the Iraq War are the same flawed assumptions that we made when we surged in Afghanistan. We overinflated the threat that came from Afghanistan. We adopted sort of an absolutist kind of point of view on force posture as far as having to put troops on the ground versus containing the Taliban, containing Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, or in the case of Iraq, containing Saddam. And I think, that those flawed assumptions, I think because we didn't recognize them about Iraq, we didn't recognize the mistakes we made in imagination before getting into Iraq, contributed to the mistakes we made in Afghanistan. Because I think we took the wrong lessons from Iraq, which is that, hey, look, we learned how to do counterinsurgency, we can do it in Afghanistan. So that's kind of the connection that I see. I see it as a larger sort of systemic failure in American foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, I and we talked about this a little bit earlier, and we talked a little bit on Twitter. I mean, I find that connection, the connection to Afghanistan, deeply strange in this logic. I mean, there's nothing about the Iraq. There's nothing about the Iraq question that anything you just said that I disagree with. Right? It's in suggesting that there is some sort of useful parallel between 2009 and 2003 You know, we can say that there were, you know, there were sort of strategic errors in both 2009 and 2003. Although, I mean, we should also recognize that there are still elements of the jury that have to come in on 2009, right? I mean, we don't have a full story about 2009 in the same way that we do about 2003. But that sort of the language you're using, right, containment of the Taliban, that we thought that there was some sort of military solution in Afghanistan in 2009, and in the same way that we thought in 2003, just seems to me to completely abstract to that what the actual U.S. experience in Afghanistan was, right, which was, of course, that we had been involved in a war in Afghanistan for 8 years already, right? And so, you know, what the relevant lessons that people were trying to learn and that people were drawing in 2009 were not the lessons of 2003, in which I think many of the military authorities had already agreed that the raiding strategy of 2003 to Iraq and then trying to leave quickly was a terrible mistake, and had sort of then taken the lesson from it that you have to adopt a robust force posture, and then applied that probably incorrectly to Afghanistan in 2009, right?
Probably.
But it seems, you know, I mean, again, I think that you know, 10 years in 2019, if the Karzai regime or the successor of the Karzai regime is still there, and it still holds Kabul, and the Taliban are, you know, still conducting a variety of different insurgencies, I mean, people are not probably going to assess that this was a failure. Right?
Well, but they should.
They're going to call it a hiccup. But
would you say, okay, but would you say if in 2019 Iraq is a democracy, people then would turn around and say that, sorry, that's my phone, people would say this was a success, that they're correct? I mean, would you sort of take the same point of view on Iraq from the perspective of it turns into sort of liberal democracy?
I think that the goals with regards to Afghanistan in 2009 were wholly different than the goals with regards to Iraq in 2003. And that because those goals were different, then they have to be assessed differently, right? And in 2009, one of the key goals was maintaining the survival of the Allied regime in Kabul. And so I think you're going to look forward to 2019, and people are going to say, well, okay, did the regime in Kabul survive? And if the regime in Kabul survived, people are going to say, oh, well, you know, okay, maybe elements of the surge into Afghanistan were mistaken, maybe it didn't have to happen, but hey, the regime survived, our Allied regime survived, so let's not complain over much about it.
Well, I guess, here's the problem I have a little bit with that argument. I mean, there's twofold problems here. One is that the fundamental error that we made in 2003, I would argue, is that we overinflated the threat that we faced from Iraq, right? We assumed that because Iraq had WMD in the past, that they would potentially use in the future and give it to terrorists, you know, because of what happened on 9/11. I mean, that is a bastardized version of what happened. That's basically the point of view that existed. My argument on Afghanistan has always been, and always was at the time, that the threat that emanated from Afghanistan was at best minimal, and was easily containable, and was containable through a whole host of, you know, force packages other than trying to put 30,000 troops on the ground and fight a counterinsurgency. So, you know, to me, the fundamental flaw that links, there's a number, but the first flaw that links Iraq and Afghanistan is the failure of assessing threats to U.S. national security interests properly, right? And so I think, you know, while I realize that we're talking about wars that were at different junctures, you know, to me it reflects a very similar failure of the policymakers to look at the potential threats to the U.S. in a manner that is judicious and is appropriate. So that's the first problem. The second problem is assuming.
I mean, let me stop.
Sure,
there.
go ahead.
We'll get to your second problem in a little bit, right? I mean, I concur that the threat from Afghanistan, say in 2001, but even threats from 2009, were the Taliban to sort of regain control of Kabul and so forth. That the threat is probably limited given a reasonable set of, you know, fairly small scale steps in terms of engaging in, you know, various counter-terror activities, limiting the ability of the Taliban regime to interact with Al-Qaeda and so forth. But again, that's not the choice that faced us. I mean, the choice that you're sort of talking here as if in 2009 we had this choice to go and start a war in Afghanistan, and we just kind of went and started a war in Afghanistan because, hey, we didn't think containment would work. But that's not what happened, right? We had a whole alliance.
Of course, it's what happened. Of course,
how many troops? Yes, exactly. But in Iraq, we did a lot more than double troop levels in 2003, right? We went from 0 to 150,000, right? In Afghanistan in 2009, we went from 60,000 to 90,000, right?
No. We went from about. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, well, or 50,000 to 100,000, right? Whatever number you want to use, right? These are entirely different types of strategic decisions. They are entirely different types of military operations, right? I mean, the United States was already engaged in war, had an allied regime in Afghanistan, right? Yeah, you're right that sort of backing off of support for that regime, that even if that regime falls, right, even if the Kabul regime collapses, and the United States completely withdraws in 2009, which I'm not actually sure you're arguing, but let's say that that's what you're arguing. The Kabul regime falls and the Taliban takes over. This is not such a disaster for American foreign policy. I mean, that's kind of what I'm getting to.
Here's the thing. You can argue, and I agree with you, that these are different military inflection points, right? I mean, the decision to invade and occupy a country is not the same thing as the decision to ramp up a counterinsurgency effort. And I get that, and I recognize the difference. But my argument, though, is that the decision making that informed going to war in Iraq and that informed the decision to surge in Afghanistan were based on similarly flawed assumptions and understandings of the world, understandings of the nature of the threat of terrorism. Okay, so I think if you look back on Iraq, right, properly, and you say that Iraq was not a threat, that Iraq was containable, that the consequences of putting troops on the ground in Iraq would lead to unforeseen consequences. The consequences would be the negative consequences. I think were not taken into account, and the limitations of what an American military could do on the ground in Iraq in 2003, versus as far as occupying the country, as far as nation building. Had we taken the lesson from that into Afghanistan in 2009, we would have approached it, I think, very differently. I mean, what I find sort of amazing. Let me finish the point, though. Let me finish the point. What I find amazing about what happened in Afghanistan in 2009 was that it was informed by what allegedly happened during the surge, that we supposedly put more troops on the ground, and this contributed to more stability. What was ignored is the previous years in which the country had fallen apart, and we had shown ourselves completely incapable of doing effective nation building. That lesson was ignored completely. So, to my mind, the key takeaway.
I honestly don't think that you are correctly characterizing what happened in the United States military between.
I'm not actually characterizing the U.S. military. Hold on. I'm characterizing the views of policymakers. I am not characterizing the views of the military, although I think we disagree a little bit on how the military took away the lessons from Iraq into Afghanistan. We can talk about that if you want to. But my argument is more about
I actually think that the decisions and the arguments made by policymakers in 2009 were in fact informed by the experience of the U.S. military in Iraq between 2003 and 2007, right?
Well, they were not. They were informed by a false narrative of what happened in Iraq in 2003 and 2007.
Between 2003 and 2007? I mean, yes. I think everyone in 2009, everyone who was debating, everyone who was trying to figure out what to do with Afghanistan, almost universally had the agreement that the United States put too few troops and used them inappropriately in Iraq between 2003 and 2007, and this led to disaster.
That's the wrong lesson. That's the wrong lesson to take away from it. That's not why stability. That's not why Iraq became stable or became more stable, or civilian intelligence declined after 2007. That's. I mean, What? Look, I can go back.
Iraq, but Michael, Iraq became unstable after 2003 and remained unstable until 2007 because the United States eliminated the regime that was there, right? I mean, that's fundamentally why Iraq became unstable, right? The United States did that in Afghanistan in 2001, right? So that die was already played, right? There was no way to unplay that in 2009.
I'm not arguing that there was. I mean, I'm not making that argument.
So you're still again, you have mentioned that we have wars here that are at different inflection points. That's really relevant here, right? And that's why your comparison is not useful, in my view, right? Is that you are talking about wars here that are at such different inflection points that it is not, to my mind, terribly useful to sort of think about what are the lessons of 2003 for Iraq and apply them to 2009 in Afghanistan. I think it's better to say we mislearned the lessons of 2007 in the application to 2009. I think that's a much more useful way of approaching it.
We mislearned the lessons of 2007. Right. I mean, look, the entire counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan was based on a false narrative of what happened in Iraq. And I mean, I've written about this quite a bit. I mean, this is not a controversial notion. I mean, we simply came to believe that the surge in Iraq and the adoption supposedly of counterinsurgency, population-centric counterinsurgency tactics is what led to a decline in civilian casualties and a decline in violence in Iraq, and that can be transmitted to Afghanistan. And we know that's not accurate. I mean, we know that the U.S. surge certainly had an impact, but it was not decisive, and the agency lies much more with Iraqis than with Americans. But I think maybe you're sort of you're being too narrow in how you're looking at this. I mean, I don't disagree with you that you're looking at different inflection points, and you're looking at different. The nature of the conflicts were very different in 2003 in Iraq, and there was no conflict yet, and in 2009 in Afghanistan. But my argument is a larger one about how policymakers, assess threats, how they assess the efficacy of using military force. And in my mind, what happened in 2003 was that we overemphasized the threat that existed from Saddam, from terrorism in general, and that flawed assumption drove the decision, or certainly informed the decision to surge in Afghanistan in 2009. Okay, I can go back and look at this. Obama talked all the time about 9/11 and the threat from Al Qaeda in justifying intervening in Afghanistan. Okay, but
Obama did not intervene in Afghanistan. I mean, that's just
I don't know how else.
It's fundamentally, surging in Afghanistan, right? It was a different environment, right?
But
the war
we
was
put
already
troops
there.
into places in Afghanistan in 2009 that we had not put troops before. Okay,
yes.
Significant troops to Helmand Province.
We had fought in Helmand Province at various times.
We were
fighting in all of these places at once.
We were not fighting in Helmand anywhere close to the level we were fighting in.
We were fighting. Yes, no, exactly. It's an escalation. It's an escalation of a war designed to solve the problem of the fact that we were in the middle of a war. Right.
I get that, but the escalation.
That's what 2009. That's what the decision in 2009 is. Right. It's about how do we sort out the fact that we have this war and it's not going particularly well. Right. And one solution may be, well, let's draw back to a counter-terror strategy. Another solution may be, let's withdraw entirely. Another solution is to escalate, right? But the war keeps happening no matter what, right? I mean, anything is utilization of military means.
I'm not disputing the point that the war still goes on. I am disputing the assumptions and the mindset of policymakers when they approach this issue. And in my mind, they had the same blind spots about what force could accomplish, about the nature of the threats, about the ability to put in place a military solution in Afghanistan that they made in Iraq in 2003. Now, I'm going to grant you all these points. These are going to be different situations, but I'm making a larger argument here about how policymakers misunderstand the nature of threats that we face. They misunderstand how effective military engagement can be in furthering U.S. national security interests. And they disregard, non-military solutions to these kind of challenges, to security challenges.
But there is no non-military solution.
Let me say one more thing. This is important because there's a constancy there in that from 2001 and 9/11 to 2009 in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what I would argue, and what I've argued in that piece and elsewhere, is that if you go before 9/11, that kind of mindset didn't really exist. Right? I mean, policymakers were much more skeptical about the use of force. They were much more solicitous of non-military approaches to dealing with security challenges. We saw this in Iraq from 91 to 2001.
Right. I would say that across the 90s you see a steady decline of skepticism. Right. That 9/11
yes, you do.
Is an inflection point. Right. But that across the 90s you see a general decline in skepticism of force.
I agree.
But the things you're
saying,
the argument you're making here that, in 2003 we thought that the military could change societies, and in 2003 we thought that there was a military solution to security problems, and in 2009 we still did. I mean, that argument leaves me just so cold, right? I mean,
Okay.
it seems to, to my mind, it explains, almost. I told you we were going to fight here, right? No, I warned you, we're going to fight, and I mean, it just, I mean, the way in which we theorize, the way that military force could change society was so different in 2003 than it was in 2009.
But it wasn't.
It really was. No, Michael, let's be clear.
I'm sorry. You know what,
Michael, let's be clear.
Yes, I see what you're saying.
Let's be clear. In 2003, the theory of military change was this, right? That the United States could remove Saddam Hussein's regime.
Right.
That it could destroy his military. That it could then leave in less than a year and establish a democracy. That was our theory of military change in 2003. The theory of military change in 2009 was that if we stay here with considerable force for the next 20 years, and I think at least on the military side they were pretty explicit about that. If we stay here with a considerable substantial force for like 20 years, then maybe things will work out, right? I mean, these are two completely different theories of how military force changes. Okay,
but the problem that you're having here is you're drilling down too much. I mean, I agree with that point. I didn't hear you properly, but you're right. The military theory was very different. But that's not the argument. I'm not talking about, the tactical, notion of how military force is employed. I'm talking about the policymakers looking at both of these situations and drawing at the same wrong conclusion and the same, flawed understanding of the effectiveness of the use of force. And what I'm arguing, and so my point, the larger point I'm going to get here, is that we misjudged the nature of the threat facing us in 2003. We misjudged in 2009. My worry is that we will continue to assess. Let me finish the point.
Go ahead.
We'll continue to assess threats, to potential security threats, in the same flawed thinking, and we will continue to. My fear is fetishize military solutions to these potential security threats, rather than non-military approaches, which we used to do more of. We used to be much better at thinking about non-military approaches. And when I look at something like Iran, what I see is, an administration that first of all says we can't contain Iran, which is ridiculous. We contained Iraq for 10 years. Of course we contained Iran. We contained nuclear powers for many, many years. And secondly, you have people who are basically saying that the use of force in Iran can be successful in retarding, the Tehran nuclear program, which is the same, foolish mindset which we exhibited in 03 in Iraq and 09 in Afghanistan, in different contexts.
I mean, there seems to be far less consensus, even within the administration and even within sort of policymaking circles, regarding the utility of force against Iran than there was in either 2003 or 2009.
There is.
So, I mean, it seems to me you're going in the right direction.
Well, but the fact you're right. But the fact that it's even being considered after the disasters that were Iraq and Afghanistan, I find mind-boggling. And I will say to you that the fact that Obama will not take a force off the table on Iran, he continues to put out there as a possibility. He's basically locked himself into a position where if Iran builds a bomb, he almost is required to use force. And then you think about the fact that if he had lost in 2012, you'd have a president in Romney who almost certainly would be solicitous of the idea of the use of force against Iran. And if the Republican were to win in 2016, you could see that actually end up happening. And that, to me, suggests that the lessons, the failures of Iraq and Afghanistan have not been internalized at all in American foreign policy thinking. That this is even on the table, even being considered. I mean, there's not a pushback against this Iran argument that is basically saying, haven't we learned the lesson that military force and can only accomplish so much, and that the threat from Iran doesn't justify going to war against them?
I think there is a pushback actually, and I think that's why.
Okay.
That's why even in policymaking circles, despite the rhetoric of the administration, I think there's considerably less support for the idea of going to war against Iran than either the 2001 decision in Afghanistan, 2003 decision in Iraq, or the incorrect analogy that you're making, the 2009 decision to surge in Afghanistan. And this is important. This is important, and let me explain why this is important. Because the people who wanted to surge in Afghanistan in 2009, even on the military side, and you are drawing far too bright of a distinction between the military side and the civilian side on this, because they go back and forth, for one. Some of the
they were more in
policymakers
tune in 09 than they were in 03. They were much more in tune in 09 than they were in 03.
There's no question. And the military, the uniformed military, also strongly contributes to the civilian debate. The military in 2009, there is no question that, at least at the the level that was relevant for policymaking. This is not to say the entire level. This is not to say every service. This is not to say even every admiral and every general. But at the policy relevant level, that they were very strongly in favor of a surge. At the same time, I think you would have seen if you'd had, and I did have conversations with some of these people. I'm sure you had conversations with these people too, that they were deeply skeptical. They were even more skeptical of 2003 than they had been in 2003. And in 2003, they had been more skeptical than civilians, right? That, within this circle that pushed the surge in 2009, the idea of waging war against Iran was crazy, right? I mean, and I think that these same people would say now the idea of waging war against Iran is crazy, right? And so that's why I have problems in trying to draw this line that you're talking about here, because to me, it's a line that zigzags all around, right? And it's a line. I guess another way to phrase it, it's not a linear relationship, right? The people who thought that war that additional force could work in a particular way in Afghanistan in 2009 were not making the same kinds of arguments that were made in 2003, and in fact, they were explicitly rejecting the arguments that were made in 2003.
I'll say again, I grant you that point. I'm not arguing over that point. I grant you that point. That's not the argument that I'm making. I absolutely agree with you that the military approach to both conflicts was completely different. I'm not disputing that. But that's not my argument. My argument is that there's a strategic incoherence among policymakers in again inflating the threat from both countries and not rejecting non-military approaches to dealing with Iraq and Afghanistan. And the thing about Iraq, and I'm still saying on Iran, that's really, really important here, and I think the point that you're kind of missing a little bit is that, this administration, which I believe does not want to go to war in Iran, has nonetheless rejected containment as a potential response to an Iranian nuclear weapon, which is an insanely foolish position to take. Because, first of all, we have a great deal of experience in containing nuclear powers, as you and I have discussed in the past. Secondly, we contained Iraq quite effectively before September 2003. And to me, the lesson to take away from Iraq was that containment of Iraq, even as flawed as that was a much more preferable option than going to war against them. Okay, because of all of the unforeseen consequences that come from the use of military force. That lesson does not seem to be imparted upon policymakers. I don't see anybody in the Republican Party who believes this. Anyone in the Republican Party who accepts the idea of containment. And
I'm sorry. Senator Rand Paul was here yesterday. I believe he accepts that.
Okay, so that's the only one.
Talking to us. He's actually not the only one, right? I mean, I think he speaks for. Frankly, I think that Senator McConnell will never say this. It's not in his nature to say this. But I think that, for example, Senator McConnell probably holds very similar views to Paul on these. A lot of Republicans do.
You might.
Right. But look, they don't vocalize them in the same way that Paul does. But that's it. We're going to come back to that. We have a Kentucky session at the.
We do have a Kentucky session here. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, let me. I understand your point here, but I guess that. It seems to me that you are not just comparing apples with oranges, which I should say is a metaphor that I hate, because why couldn't you compare apples and oranges, right? I mean, you should be able to compare apples and oranges, right? They're two fruit. They're right there next to each other. You're like comparing apples and eggs, right? Which is a much more problematic.
Apples and bicycles.
To sort of draw this out, for some reason we seem to be about to go to war with North Korea. Right, for reasons that seems to be utterly not understandable from our point of view, right?
Yeah.
And what I see here, in terms of that we've stepped up B-52 flights, we've stepped up B-2 flights. I think it's unlikely we're going to go to war with North Korea. It seems to be a horrifically absurd notion that we're going to war with North Korea. But when I see us engaging in these B-52 flights, I say to myself, well, I mean, this is pretty standard defense strategic statecraft, right? That is not at all out of sorts with how the United States has thought about force even since the Vietnam War, right? Even since 1975. And so when I see people talking about the relationship with North Korea in militarized terms, I say, well, military has to be part of this conversation, right? I mean, it's not all of the conversation, and the United States should not go to war against North Korea unless North Korea attacks the United States. But military options have to be somewhere, right? We have to be thinking in these terms. And, that seems to me just to be sort of bog standard statecraft rather than has something that has a linear relationship from 2003 to 2009 to the great 2013 re-engagement of the Korean War. And I guess I sort of think about the Iran thing in the same way, right? I mean,
I'm sorry, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, we're actually legally at war with North Korea. I mean, we have 34,000 troops along the Korean border. They have nuclear weapons. They could potentially attack a key ally of ours. I mean, Iran doesn't offer any of the same challenge to the United States or anybody else in the region, for that matter. They're a third-rate military power.
Oh, I agree completely. There's no disagreement here.
So I guess I'm not seeing the North Korea analogy to what I mean, because I haven't, I mean,
the emotional experience you're having right now, not being able to understand the analogy, is the same emotional experience I've been having for most of this conversation.
Well, I mean, okay, okay, but I guess the problem I'm having here is that you really are comparing apples and bicycles. I mean, you're comparing a country that has a nuclear weapon and a country that does not have a nuclear weapon, right? We didn't. I mean, use Korea as an example. We didn't go to war against North Korea to stop them from getting a nuclear bomb in 2002. In fact, we basically ignored it. And guess what? They built a nuclear bomb, and it didn't have much effect on the Korean Peninsula as far as the strategic impact of that. Now, you and I have argued in the past, and I do believe that Iran getting a bomb would have a much different impact in the Middle East than it does in the Far East. But nonetheless, we have plenty of evidence, Korea being one example, that we are able to contain nuclear powers. Right? I mean, that is the tradition, that is the legacy of the Cold War in key regards. That we have shown an ability to, we understand how to contain a nuclear power like Iran. And for some reason, those lessons seem to be completely forgotten by American policymakers.
Let's use this as a transition to the next point, right? I mean, what if I were to say that Obama almost certainly understands that a nuclear Iran can be contained, that Biden almost certainly understands that nuclear Iran can be contained, that probably most of the key policymakers in the administration understand that a nuclear Iran can be contained, and that what we're seeing right now is rhetoric, right? And which is not to say you can't put yourself into a rhetorical box, but what we're really seeing right now is rhetoric and not sort of, as you have suggested, this sort of kind of flawed mindset. And I think this drags us into what we're going to talk about next, which is Obama's trip to Israel.
Okay, but before we do that, look, that's a slippery argument that I reject. I mean, you're right, and I agree with you. This administration does not want to believe containment would work and doesn't want to go to war with Iran. The fact that they can't say that, it should be troubling to both of us, troubling to everybody, to all of us concerned about the possibility of a war with Iran. The fact is that by saying Iran is not containable, by saying force on the table, they have basically explicitly validated that strategy being adopted by a future Republican administration. Okay, Republicans will, if they were to win 2016, they would, and they want to go to war against Iran. It wasn't Rand Paul who was the Republican president. They would use Obama's rhetoric on Iran as justification for doing so. They'd say, look what Obama said. He said he can't contain Iran's nuclear program. So
you're right.
I just step back one way. I approach this issue from a very sort of like 50,000 foot view, which just says that this piece I wrote for Foreign Affairs last year about threat assessment, and this is a big part of the way I think about foreign policy and national security. We habitually misunderstand threats and misunderstand challenges. Okay, and to me, that failure to misunderstand potential threats is maybe our most significant foreign policy failure, but maybe failure of imagination among policymakers. Okay, and that's the link that I see between. I mean, I see other links, but that's the main link I see between Iraq and Afghanistan and Iran. Okay, then in all three places we exaggerate the potential threat of these countries, that they represent to the U.S., whether it's nuclear weapons, whether it's weapons of mass destruction, whether it's terrorism. And because we misunderstand those threats, we make really poor decisions. And those poor decisions, 2003 going to war against Iraq, 2009 going to war against Afghanistan, 2017 going to war against Iran. Who knows?
In 2009, we didn't go to war against Afghanistan. We were already at war.
Sorry. Let me rephrase that. Escalating the war in Afghanistan in a foolish effort that has failed and that has cost many American lives and done very little to further the U.S. national security interests. I mean, that is, to me, the flawed thinking is identical among all three. And I get your point. There are different inflection points in these conflicts. But until we start thinking about the world as it really is and threats as they really are, we're going to keep making these stupid decisions to go to war, and we're going to keep, putting our military in places they shouldn't be in order to fight wars that don't further our national interest. That's my concern, and that's the link that I see between all of these conflicts, all of these past conflicts and possibly future conflicts and present conflicts.
I mean, I guess I don't think that there's anything exceptional about the United States in this regard, right? Beyond the fact that the United States has the capability to put troops anywhere in the world, right? I mean, I think that states make errors of threat assessment all the time, and all kinds of different states make errors of threat assessment.
That's not really that's not really a response. I mean, you're saying that
right.
Everyone does it isn't really.
Well, it's an international relations way.
It's more. But I would say that there's a very strong legacy in American diplomacy, American foreign policy of actually of not overreacting to threats. Okay, I mean, I know this may sound an odd thing to say, but if you look at the history of the Cold War from Truman to the fall of the Berlin Wall, there were places where we exaggerated threats and we made terrible mistakes, and Vietnam is the obvious example of that. But there were plenty of places where threats were inflated, and policymakers wisely didn't take the bait. And Cuban Missile Crisis is the most obvious example, but Dien Bien Phu in 1954 with Eisenhower, Laos in 1961 with
not every threat inflation leads to war, right? I mean, I think it's easily arguable that the Cuban Missile Crisis was all about threat inflation that almost led to war, right? And that in fact, what the Kennedy administration, the reason we had a crisis in the first place is because the Kennedy administration decided to engage in radical threat inflation, right? That the alternative here was not, threat inflation leads to war, it's don't inflate threats, and there was never a Cuban Missile Crisis in the first place. Right, and I think it's also easily arguable that the Korean War is about threat inflation, right? The entire Cold War, this argument has certainly been made, the entire Cold War is about threat inflation.
Absolutely.
And deliberate threat inflation on the part of the Truman administration.
Absolutely.
I've scare the hell out of the American people.
The entire Cold War, I agree with you.
I don't entirely agree with that, right? But the argument has been made.
Right, and I should say that I don't entirely. I mean, I agree that the threat inflation from the Cold War, it's not entirely threat inflation, but it's certainly a big part of it is threat inflation. However, my point I'm making here is that we have consistently throughout history demonstrated a judicious use of military power. Because we've assessed, we made sort of proper cost-benefit analysis in the use of military force. I mean, I would say that that Eisenhower and Kennedy and Reagan and to some extent the first Bush and Clinton all looked at sort of the cost of going to war and sort of said benefits are not worth it. I fear that has the balance has shifted in that we sort of don't kind of grasp fully the cost of war and we overinflate the benefits of military engagement. And I'm a big devotee of the Powell Doctrine and I should say the Weinberger Doctrine. And later the Powell Doctrine, in the sense that that was a doctrine that basically was a check on use of military force, and it was one that I think more properly took into account actual U.S. national security interests into whether or not we should use force in the first place. And I feel like we've lost touch with that, and that's what worries me about the debate about Iran is that
Yeah, I mean, I guess I interpret the Powell Doctrine as entirely different. Right? That the Powell Doctrine is an effort by the uniformed military to restrict policy-making freedom of civilian policy.
Okay, but policymakers willingly accepted that principle.
Oh, sure.
I mean, three presidents, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton, all willingly accepted that, and they embraced it.
They were willing to live within the restrictions that the uniformed military had set with them for them to a certain extent.
No, that's not.
That
no.
it wasn't. That didn't mean. That doesn't mean that it wasn't that they accepted it. Is not to say that there wasn't a very specific, very particular effort to create those limits.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Weinberger Doctrine. He said it. I mean, I know he was informed by Colin Powell. I get that, but there was a sense within all three of these administrations that we had to be, again, much more judicious about the use of force. And I would argue that in 2001, we threw that out the window completely. Not just on Iraq, but to some extent on Afghanistan as well. And, we have to get back to a mindset when we think about use of force that is more rational. And we've lost that. I mean, that's what I look at this Iran debate, and it's amazing to me people just don't say, this is a stupid idea. Like, and policymakers don't say this. Politicians don't say it. And no people say privately.
I mean, a lot of people do. I don't know. You do. I do.
Oh, but, who listens to us? I mean, hopefully, a few people. But, I mean, we're not
our
the ones
seven
driving
commenters. The 7 commenters of Foreign Entanglements listen to us. Let's not.
Right. And look, and you and I,
don't
I'm sure.
try to eliminate their experience, their lived experience, Michael. I mean, that's.
Okay, I don't mean to, obviously, but I'm saying, and I appreciate them listening, I really do. But you and I wasn't writing on this publicly in 2003, but I was opposed to the Iraq War. I'm sure you were as well. Nobody listened to us, right? I mean, a lot of academics, a lot of smart people said, we're going to war in Iraq is a really stupid effing idea, right? And nobody listened to them. And I just, sorry. I wrote, I mean, here's the thing too. I mean, I said in 2009 repeatedly that going to war, surging in Afghanistan, putting more troops down is a really stupid idea, and it's going to lead to disaster. Maybe not disaster, but certainly not going to work out well. And that view was basically, I think, has been confirmed. And to a large extent, I was in a significant minority in holding that view, expressing that view, right? And I think if you would look back 10 years earlier on something like Afghanistan, there never would have been that kind of impetus to go to surge in Afghanistan. Look back in '83 in Lebanon and Reagan. I mean, he's after the Marine Bears bombing. He's all right, let's get the hell out of here. I mean. The mindset has changed in to my mind, a very damaging way.
I mean, once again, Michael, I think that you are comparing apples and orangutan right now. I mean, I think that you're making comparisons that simply don't hold the weight that you want to put on them. But anyway,
okay. I mean, that's fine. Can we move on? That's fine.
Can we move on to Israel? Can we move on to?
We can move on. To
we have 2 things we have to talk about: Israel and Kentucky.
Okay.
What
have a lot in common.
Right, exactly. So what was your thinking on Obama's trip to Israel?
I mean, my verdict is kind of meh. I thought, look, Israel's in the Israel-Palestinian situation is in a very tough spot right now, and in the sense that, okay, this is what I found odd about Obama's speech. Obama gave the speech where basically said Israelis and Palestinians have to trust each other, and Israelis have to see Palestinians as equals, and they have to accept the idea of a Palestinian state. And, look, the fact is that 2/3 of Israelis, maybe more, accept the idea of a Palestinian state along 6-7 borders, right? I mean, they basically recognize that this is something that should happen. The problem is they don't trust the Palestinians, and they don't see a partner for peace, right? So there's this weird divide where you have the same number of Israelis who say we should have a Palestinian state, who also say it's never going to happen, or similar percentages. Right. So the second part is where Obama needs to focus on, okay? A, convincing Israelis that they're a partner for peace, and B, for actually trying to create a process to make that possible. Okay, he didn't do that. He had one line in that speech about PA and Abbas being partners for peace, which was good, but that should have been really the focal point of what he was talking about, because that's really the issue. And I feel like the speech he gave would have been appropriate, 20 years ago. But that in the current sort of situation between Israelis and Palestinians, it's not relevant in the slightest. The two sides are never going to trust each other fully. A deal that happens is a pragmatic deal that is made by Israelis who basically come to the realization that maintaining the status quo is no longer tenable for them, and thus they will give it up. That's how it has to happen. And the only outside force that can make that happen, outside of global isolation for Israel, is the United States. And I saw nothing from that speech that made me think that the U.S. is going to play that kind of active role. So I came away from the whole thing kind of, meh.
Right. I mean, I guess my assessment is similar. While at the, I have my doubts about the ability of the United States to supply either A, sufficient pressure to, because when we talk about 2/3 of Israelis, basically being in favor of this notion of a Palestinian state, that means that 1/3 of Israelis, and I don't know, probably really a growing number of Israelis, is pretty hostile to the notion, right? And these are who already live in the West Bank and part of the population of the West Bank. And of course, we know in democratic politics, it's not simply a case in any country of sort of a generalized democratic preference being translated unproblematically into policy, right? And I think broadly the issue within Israeli politics is that you have this 2/3 out there that kind of wants a Palestinian state, They don't care about it as much as the 1/3 that really doesn't want a Palestinian state. And you also have the same problem that this 2/3, in part because they don't care about it so much, don't believe that it's possible, right? And so this is a situation where I'm sort of coming to doubt how much or how efficacious outside pressure can really be in this. Which is, and I should hasten to add this, right? Which is not to say that the United States should continue sort of de facto support of, which we really are, right? De facto support of increased settlements in the West Bank and so forth, right? It's just to say, I myself have significant doubts about the ability of the United States to furnish the conditions for a reasonable compromise.
I have significant doubts as well, but the fact is that becomes an excuse, not an explanation. Right. And the way I look at it is this. I mean, you are getting very close to a point, in the foreseeable future in which a Palestinian state is no longer viable. Okay? If, for example, I don't think it's going to happen, but if the Israelis were to decide to build along the E1 corridor, that would make a Palestinian state very hard to achieve. If they continue to build settlements in the West Bank, that'll make it hard for a Palestinian state to ever emerge. If the PA dissolves, yes, all these problems. And that creates a situation for the U.S. that's very damaging in that they're going to be basically the biggest international supporter of a country that is basically a apartheid state. And that is the future that faces the U.S. in the region. Okay. Now, it's possible the U.S. is okay with that. It's possible the U.S. will obfuscate over that point. But at some point, I think this is a serious challenge for policymakers that they don't seem to be recognizing. And so if you have an option here, you can basically accept the status quo and accept that Israel is going to become this illiberal state, an undemocratic state, basically, if it isn't already. If it continues to maintain control of Palestinians, West Bank, and Gaza, or from the West Bank, but from Cajun the Palestinians in Gaza, or you actually try to engage in diplomacy and push a peace process forward. Okay. Now, I don't actually agree with you that you have to put pressure on the Israelis. I mean, it would help to do that, but I think there's and we saw in the Hagel hearings, all kinds of reasons why it's not going to happen because the political costs are too great. It does not mean that you can't send John Kerry to the region to try to engage in a diplomatic initiative. That might happen. I didn't hear Obama say that in his speech. That would be a useful thing to actually take place, is if there was a follow-up to what Obama said in his speech. But I'm not sure that's going to happen. I hope so. If it happens, then I'll revise my view of it. But unless the U.S. wants to get significantly engaged in this situation, nothing is going to change in the near term. And if it does change, it'll come because there's more violence from the Palestinians, or because Israel's international isolation will grow, which will not happen soon, but may happen eventually.
Right. I mean, I guess I don't have anything more to contribute than what you just said. Right? I don't think there's anything wrong about what you said. It seems entirely reasonable. It's just. I mean, I hear what you say and said, "Oh my God, that's so depressing." Right.
Right. If only you would demonstrate such perceptive views in our earlier conversation, we wouldn't have that big argument.
It's like, let's throw John Kerry at the problem and see if something works out, right? And okay, that's fine.
He is the Secretary of State. I mean, if he can't do it, then who can?
So, to the altogether more important and relevant issues of Kentucky politics.
Kentucky politics, yeah.
Kentucky, and I don't know if it was a nation or Mother Jones or whatever. There was Kentucky has recently become sort of an epicenter of senatorial politics in the United States. Right? We have two senators, the esteemed Senator McConnell, who's of course the Senate Minority Leader, and Senator Paul. Senator Paul, of course, as you know, as everyone knows. Well, no, frankly, let's not say as everyone knows. Let's say as the extraordinarily small minority of people who pay a lot of attention to foreign policy. Right. Knows recently engaged in a long filibuster in which he strongly rejected the notion that Americans on American soil should be drone striked by the Obama administration. And there was a little bit more to it than that. But and so there's really some interest here, right? I mean, so Kentucky senators are really getting a lot of attention, or at least Paul is. McConnell doesn't want attention, right? Right. McConnell is not the sort of person who wants attention. And then until yesterday, there was the looming question of whether Ashley Judd, Kentucky actually she's not a Kentucky native, but a Kentucky associated, Ashley Judd,
Right.
was going to run for Senator McConnell's position in 2014, and this had, it gained a lot of attention. It was fascinating because there was the prospect here of switching out McConnell for not just a Democrat, but a person who would be one of the most left-wing Democrats in
and then some.
the Senate, right? And that hasn't worked out. She announced yesterday that it wasn't going to be able to happen. And people have questioned whether she had a serious chance at McConnell. But I should say that with regards to Kentucky, people who are not from Kentucky dramatically overstate the extent to which Republicans have a lock on the two Senate.
Well, that's interesting. I mean,
right.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago the Democrats used to win in Kentucky. I think Clinton won there twice, didn't he?
Well, yeah, Clinton. I think Clinton did win here twice, right? Obama got destroyed in both
right.
2008 and 2012. But Senator McConnell won by just a hair's breadth against Bruce Lunsford in 2008 in an election that Lunsford was fairly widely regarded as a Democratic candidate. In a Republican wave year in 2010, Rand Paul won by a pretty small margin against a stronger Democratic candidate, but one who
in a tough year for Democrats, though.
Right, it was an incredibly tough year for Democrats, right?
Yeah.
And Paul won by a very narrow margin. Similarly, in 2004, the election was very tight between Democrats and Republicans. So really, the last three senatorial races in Kentucky have been very tight between Democrats and Republicans.
Right.
Republicans have won all of them. But Mitch McConnell is one of the least popular senators in America, even within Kentucky, right? And so this is a state that Democrats can win.
But here's what I find fascinating about Kentucky, if I might say, and I've just been thinking about this for a little while, but you have in McConnell and Rand Paul the really it sums up the utter dysfunction and nefariousness of the modern Republican Party. And what I mean by that, dysfunction, nefariousness, and abject sort of craziness of the current Republican Party. So with McConnell, you have a guy who basically doesn't care at all about policy, right? Who just cares about political power, and is sort of the personification of the obstructionism of Republicans, and the extent to which they have basically made our democracy dysfunctional. I mean, it's funny. I
think that's mostly. I mean, being here, you find out that McConnell does care about something. I mean, so.
He cares about people spending money in political campaigns. He cares about that.
Well, but I mean, he has certain commitments. Like he's done a ton of work on the Burma thing, for example. And so there are some things where he actually does have strong commitments.
Okay, but I mean,
that's not a central persona.
Everyone has their pet issues, I suppose.
Right. You're mostly
even
right.
Nixon had his pet issues, but in general, Mitch McConnell's all about political power, and he's all about the obstructing, Democrats. And again, I was just saying this, 20 years, I've written this book. In 1991 about dysfunction in American politics, and I feel like, and I know the author's emailing them saying, "You've seen nothing," right? Because what we see now is utterly a political system that is at its most dysfunctional, maybe ever in American politics, and it is certainly in a sort of post-Civil War era, I suppose you could say. It's a complete disaster, and it's largely because of someone of Mitch McConnell. Now, on the other hand, you have Rand Paul, who really does represent the sort of the nuttiness of the current GOP. And I say that, I don't mean to be kind of too harsh, but look, the drone thing is fascinating in the sense that I don't really think that Rand Paul cares about drones hitting Americans in Yemen. I think he wants to play up the fear among conservatives that Obama's going to send drones against them because he wants to take their guns. I mean, I think that's what drove that filibuster more than anything else. Certainly the risk of Obama killing someone with a drone, it's just sort of absurd.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is part of an internally coherent vision that Senator Paul and his father, perhaps even to a greater extent, had with regards to the negotiation between state and local power, between federal, state, local, and private power, which is to say that, broadly speaking, and there are huge exceptions here, but broadly speaking, Rand Paul does not want the federal government to interfere in private decisions, right? Whether this is, and he even said yesterday, he doesn't give a damn how people make contracts for marriages, right? So a very libertarian case for gay marriage. He, has said, he said resisting the drug war, right? He said anti-drug war things. And he says anti-trans right things, right? All of these are about sort of the, preventing the federal government from interfering in the lives of people. Now, he's also pretty explicit that, or he has been in the past, that this also means that the federal government shouldn't be able to interfere in the ability of a shop owner to prevent African Americans from sitting at dining tables. And Rand Paul is clear about that. That's how he understands this, and it's internally coherent, and it makes sense to him. And
can I make one interjection, if I could?
Yeah.
You are correct to the extent to which that argument basically ends where a woman's uterus begins.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes. And that was going to be that was the next thing I was going to say, right? And
okay. Good.
Gigantic, glaring exception. With regard. Yeah. No.
Yes.
And there are some other ones along the way too. There are some other ones along the way, but that's the biggest, right? Really, the biggest one is that, and you can think if you want, you could try to explain that away, right? And say, oh well, he probably doesn't care that much about the issue. You just can't succeed in politics being pro-choice these days. I haven't really sort of plumbed that, but we should take him at face value, right? If he says that women's uteruses should be the purview of the state, then we should believe him when he essentially makes that case.
Okay, but that's completely contradictory to his otherwise libertarian views.
Yes.
It's completely contradictory.
Yeah. And so anyway, with that gigantic glaring exception, there's a consistent worldview here for Rand Paul that is, I think to people who've paid attention to American politics for a long time, it's not hard to recognize this. I mean, this is sort of it has Western aspects to it, it has Southern aspects to it, in part why, the Texas connection, and it's a very old notion of resistance to federal power.
Yeah,
and this drone strike thing, is part of that. It's not surprising that it's part of that. And that's fine, and there are virtues to that, right? Especially the anti-drug war, which is probably the single biggest thing that Americans can't think seriously about, right? The drug war is so much of a worse thing than drone strikes.
Well, maybe I put climate change above that, but okay.
Right. Well, whatever. But when you're interpreting what Rand Paul's saying, you have to understand this is where he's coming from, right? And you have to understand that in a lot of ways this is a bad place, right? This is a bad place that he's coming from, and it's a bad place that's been bad for a very long time. Yeah, this good thing that he kind of wants is great, but it's part of a whole bad package.
It is, and I think one thing that I was really disturbed by was watching so many liberals basically praise Rand Paul because of his drone views, and for three reasons. One, his views on drones are a total what's the word I'm looking for? Diversion from the real issues about drones. If he had filibustered on the grounds that I want to see the OLC memo that justifies the killing of al-Awlaki, that would have been great. It's not what he did. He basically played politics on the drones issue. The second problem I have with Paul is the abortion issue, obviously, too. I mean, the fact that liberals are praising this guy on civil liberties when he basically believes that a woman should have control of her own reproductive rights is insane, and it's by the way, a real problem I see in the left in general, in which they sort of make this carve-out for abortion, as if, that we'll make an exception there because people have strongly held views about it. If you are a liberal and you are a feminist, then you certainly, should be a no back down, no retreat on that issue. So I'm always surprised to see liberals who are strong liberals make this, and even libertarians who harp on Paul's opposition to drones and ignore the fact that he's terrible on abortion issue and reproductive rights.
Right.
And the third thing is, this is the real problem, is that, the perspective of liberals, but Ron Paul is terrible on foreign policy. They love to focus on the fact that he's opposed to military use of force, and I'm all for that. But, he wants to pull out of the UN. He basically wants to cut foreign aid dramatically. I have to check. I think he wants to pull out of NATO. I know he's down to pull out of NATO. He is not necessarily isolationist, but he's certainly in that sort of spectrum of being near isolationist. And, I understand the idea of not wanting to get involved in a war in Iran, and he was certainly opposed to the surge, and I respect that. But, on a host of foreign policy issues that are much, frankly, in some ways more important. When you think about global architecture, when you think about, burden sharing, when you think about, sort of pro-democracy and global public health, things like that, he is in a terrible place on those issues. And that should concern liberals. Because those are issues in which there's not a great deal of political constituency for them. And this is a guy who I fear is going to win an election, win the Republican nomination in 2016, and run around the country basically talking about, how we need to apply to the UN, how we need to sort of cut back on foreign aid and sort of step back from the world. Right. I have to say, having said all of that, I think actually Rand Paul is, so far, I'm somewhat impressed with him politically. I mean, I'm not impressed with him policy-wise, but politically, this thing on immigration where he basically came out in support-ish of path to citizenship, he is certainly much savvier than Marco Rubio. Right. He seems to be, and on the drone thing, even though I think his position was BS, it was very smart politically. It was in the Republican Party. I'm impressed with Rand Paul.
I would concur with that. Right, that he has displayed much sounder political instincts,
yes.
I think, than his father, and I think that a lot of people suspect that he would win. And I guess this really shouldn't be surprising, right? He was able to win a Senate race, and his father would never have been able to win a Senate race. And right? He was able to win in a Republican wave year and in a fairly Republicanish moving state. But still, I mean, he has much defter political
yes, he does.
Instincts than I think anyone gave him credit for in 2010.
And I think I agree with you, and I think that Rand Paul is he will be a formidable candidate within the Republican Party for the nomination. I do not think he could win a national election, but I think that within the political, and I will say this though, I don't think he can win. But you make a point earlier that his sort of anti-centralism that is sort of essential to his political ideology is a very powerful point of view in American politics, and it always has been. I think the problem is that he's not an operational liberal, obviously, and that often trips up conservatives. But he talks the talk. He has a good rhetorical template for running for national office. I don't think he can win, but I'll tell you what. Right now, if I were betting on who's the Republican nominee in 2016, I think he's got as good a chance as anybody in that party does.
Oh, I mean, it's going to be fascinating, right? Because to the extent that he becomes more of a genuine, and there are, and we should hasten to add here that he suffers a major handicap in terms of being up for election in 2016 for Kentucky Senate, because Kentucky state law, to my understanding, and people in comments can correct me if I'm wrong, prevents someone from being on both the presidential primary and the senatorial primary.
Interesting.
Right. And Kentucky is a late primary, so theoretically, and I guess maybe this is the way you square the circle, right? Is that by the time he could win the nomination before he get to Kentucky, right? And that people could write him in on the ballot, and
sure.
I guess that's probably all you would need, right? I mean, since Kentucky Republicans would come out and vote for him, there's no question. And so that's maybe how you solve that problem. But there are issues.
But he's clearly running for president. There's no question about it. He's running in 2016.
I think it's going to be really fascinating to watch our friends. I'm using the quotes here, but I don't want to fully use I mostly just want to use the quotes here. Our friends in the neoconservative movement, right? Which still sort of holds the keys of the foreign policy machine in the Republican Party.
That's right.
Right? They hold keys through because they control most of the major think tanks that supply all of the senators and all of the representatives with their foreign policy talking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. To what extent they try to co-opt Rand Paul, to what extent they succeed in co-opting Rand Paul, and then to what extent, if they can't co-opt Rand Paul, they absolutely go apeshit about the Rand Paul candidates.
Well, here's the great question.
2016 primary.
If you're a neocon, right, and you have to choice between Rand Paul and Hillary, who do you support? I mean, it's not so obvious.
Yeah.
It's not so obvious. I mean, Hillary she's a really good liberal hawk. If you like liberal hawks, she's as good as they get in the Democratic Party right now. And, she's up there. And, if you're a neocon, I mean, you look at that situation, if you care most about foreign policy, Hillary Clinton looks a little more attractive to you than Rand Paul in some key regards. Because this is a guy who is the antithesis of a neocon, right, within the Republican Party. Which is, by the way, that's the one reason why I think he might not win, because I think that would be a problem for him. I mean, I think what's interesting that he's doing now is he's cultivating this sort of libertarian, kind of wing within the party that is sort of, skeptical of America's role in the world. That's actually not a bad approach to take in the primaries, but it's going to be a problem. He's going to get hit hard from the Rubios of the world for turning his back on American leadership and such.
Right. It's going to be fun to watch, and if there's one thing that I live in Kentucky, and so we enjoy the attention paid to Kentucky. Everybody does, but there is just sort of nothing more appealing than the terror which will grip Bill Kristol's tiny heart as Rand Paul approaches clinching the Republican nomination. Right.
I would agree.
And our friend Eli and everyone else. Right.
Oh yeah.
Sort of part of that
yeah.
movement. Sort of watching as this happens and just watching the histrionics at
right. Well,
that community.
You could say that them watching this would be a bit like us we missed the chance, but having been able to watch Ashley Judd run for Senate in Kentucky, which would have been, the shit show to end all shit shows. I mean, as a Democrat, I think it would have been terrible, but as a political observer, the joy of watching that race would have been, substantial. I'm kind of bummed she's not running in that sense. It would have been quite a mess if she had actually decided to get in there. I mean, she could never win. And I can't only imagine the things that she would say and the ads probably would run against her in Kentucky.
Right. She was unlikely to win, right? I mean, she is fairly popular here for a variety of reasons, but she was unlikely to win. Anyway, we've already kind of gone over time, so not that there's really a limit, but thank you, Foreign Entanglements viewers. Thank you, Michael. I think this one has been fantastic, right?
I enjoyed this one, yeah.
So Foreign Entanglements viewers, thank you for watching, and tune in next time. And Michael, we need to do this again soon.
Absolutely.
All right.
All right.